containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece, and Africa as the birthplace.
Imagine you're digging in the dirt of ancient Jerusalem, right? You're expecting to find the historical evidence of Moses, but instead, you uncover the philosophical fingerprints of Plato.
Yeah, which is, it's a completely jarring concept.
Exactly. Or, imagine translating an ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic text, one that was carved thousands of years before the first century, and you're reading a story that mirrors the Gospels almost word for word.
Right.
Today, we are taking a sledgehammer to the historical timeline of Western civilization, and we're looking at the foundational texts of our culture through an entirely different lens. If you, listening right now, have ever just assumed that the historical origins of Judaism and Christianity were settled, concrete facts, prepare yourself for a massive paradigm shift.
It really is a profound disruption of the timeline, the one you were likely taught in school. For decades, conventional historians have operated on this very specific set of assumptions about how our religious and cultural history unfolded. And we are going to put those assumptions under a microscope today.
Yeah, we really are. Our mission in this deep dive is to act as forensic investigators. We've got this towering stack of historical, archaeological, and textual sources in front of us. We're synthesizing the groundbreaking works of scholars like Gerald Massey, Martin Bernal, who wrote the incredibly influential book Black Athena, Russell Gmirkin, Walter Williams, and the recent archaeological findings of Dr. Jonathan Adler.
And we're using their research to critically assess the assumptions made by conventional scholars. To give us a solid baseline, we're using a highly regarded work, The Scepter and the Star, The Messiahs of the Dead Sea Scrolls by Dr. John J. Collins.
Right, because Collins' work is, it's kind of the perfect anchor for this discussion. It really represents the mainstream consensus.
Exactly. When Collins looks at ancient literature like the Dead Sea Scrolls, he operates on the assumption that these texts help establish the context for a historical Jesus, an ancient Mosaic Torah, and this continuous, literal, biblical Jewish history.
So our core question today is, do the primary sources, the dirt and the comparative mythologies, actually support that continuous timeline? Or do they demonstrate something entirely different, like a late-stage Hellenistic synthesis of pre-existing Egyptian mythology, African traditions, and Greek civic laws?
Which is a huge question.
It's massive. But before we jump in, I do need to explicitly note to you, the listener, that the sources we're unpacking today touch upon deeply held religious beliefs and some historically charged claims. As always on this show, we are not taking sides or endorsing any specific viewpoints.
Absolutely.
Our job is just to impartially report and unpack the fascinating, sometimes controversial claims contained in this original source material. We want to explain the mechanics behind these arguments so that you can evaluate the evidence yourself.
And to truly evaluate the evidence for these narratives, we really cannot start in the first century. And we can't start in the Hellenistic era either.
Wait, really? Where do we start then?
We have to bypass Greece and Rome entirely at first. We had to travel much further back in time to ancient Egypt.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, we have to examine the astonishing, literally documented parallels between the central figure of the New Testament and the deities of the Nile River Valley.
Okay, let's unpack this because, if conventional historians argue that the Gospels are strict history-like actual biographies of a person walking the earth in the first century, how do scholars like Gerald Massey explain the exact point-for-point parallels appearing in Egyptian temples thousands of years earlier? Like, is Massey arguing this is just a massive cultural coincidence?
No, not at all. Massey argues that coincidence is mathematically and historically impossible here. In his works, specifically the historical Jesus and the mythical Christ and the natural Genesis, he meticulously traces nearly 200 instances of direct correspondence.
200.
Yeah. Direct links between the Egyptian sun deity, whether we're talking about Horus, Osiris, or Ra, and the gospel Jesus. He points out that the Egyptian precursor figure, Ayusa, or Ayuamhedep, translates directly to the coming divine son who heals or saves.
Wait, so the very concept of a messianic son who heals was already embedded in Egyptian culture. But how did that work? Was Ayusa considered a real historical person who lived in Egypt?
No, and that is the crucial distinction Massey makes. It was deeply embedded, but it was absolutely not historical. It was an astronomical and solar allegory.
Okay.
The ancient Egyptian sages viewed the coming as a recurring symbolic event. The Messianic sun, symbolized by the sun, came cyclically. He was born daily at sunrise and yearly at the winter solstice.
Right, tracking the sun.
Exactly. It was a spiritual principle of renewal and the triumph of light over darkness. It was never intended to be understood as an individual man expected to arrive at a specific historic date.
This brings up the nativity scenes at the Temple of Luxor, which, honestly, when I was reading the source material, completely caught me off guard.
Yeah, it's wild.
Because this temple was built by Pharaoh Amenhotep III, right, of the 18th dynasty. That places its construction over 1,000 years before the 1st century. And Massey describes the hieroglyphics on the inner sanctum walls depicting a virgin birth. But I want to make sure I understand the mechanism here. In an ancient Egyptian context, what does a virgin birth actually mean?
Well, in the Egyptian esoteric tradition, the virgin was a mystical representation of the mother of the Messiah, representing pure, unmanifested matter, like the cosmic womb.
Oh, I see.
So a virgin birth symbolized a divine spiritual entity entering into physical matter, becoming flesh. If you look at the sequence of the Luxor panels, it's honestly startling. First, you have the god Thoth announcing to the Virgin Mother that she will give birth to a divine son.
Like an annunciation.
Exactly like that.
Yeah.
Next, the god Neph mysteriously impregnates her with the breath of life. And then you have the birth itself.
And accompanying that birth, the hieroglyphics show 3 solar deities offering gifts to the newly born divine infant.
Yes. 3 specific deities bringing gifts to adore the newborn Savior.
Wait, that is exactly the narrative of the Magi, the 3 wise men in the Gospel of Matthew.
It's identical.
But how is it possible that a 1st century Jewish text has the exact same visual sequence as a 14th century BCE Egyptian temple? Did the Gospel writers travel to Luxor to look at the walls? How did this cultural transmission actually happen?
That's the pivotal question of transmission, right? And you don't need the gospel writers to visit Luxor because these motifs were not locked in a single temple. They permeated the entire Mediterranean world through mystery schools and syncretic cults.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right. By the Hellenistic period, Alexandria in Egypt was the intellectual capital of the world. You had massive populations of Hellenized Jewish scholars living side by side with Egyptian priests and Greek philosophers. These ancient solar motifs were part of the shared cultural currency.
So everyone knew these stories.
Exactly. To the ancients, those 3 gift-bearing figures were astronomically linked to the 3 stars in the belt of the constellation Orion.
Oh, Orion's belt.
Yes, which points directly to Sirius, the star that announced the annual flooding of the Nile and the birth of the new sun at the solstice.
Wow. So the narrative was essentially written in the stars, observed by ancient astronomers, and then encoded into religious myth way before it was ever written on parchment.
Precisely.
But let me push back a little here, representing the skeptical listener. If this is all astronomy, who are the 12 disciples in the boat with Jesus? I mean, they have names, they have personalities in the text.
Well, in the Egyptian mythos that Massey analyzes, the 12 were not historical men either. They were representations of the 12 astronomical powers, the 12 signs of the zodiac, or what the Egyptians called the saviors of the treasure of light.
The zodiac, of course.
Right. They were the great spirit children of the sun god's might who accompanied Horus to earth as sowers of the seed and reapers of the harvest.
Sowers of the seed and reapers of the harvest. Jesus uses those exact same agricultural metaphors to describe the mission of his 12 disciples in the Gospel of John.
He does.
But what about the specific miracles? I mean, the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead is presented as one of the most concrete, unique, historical proofs of Jesus' divinity in the New Testament. Conventional scholars point to the specificity of that story. It happens in a specific town, Bethany, to a specific family. How does Massey deconstruct something that feels so historical?
Massey tackles the Lazarus narrative through comparative mythology and etymology. In the Egyptian mythos, the central drama is Horus raising his dead father Osiris from the grave. This narrative existed in Egyptian papyri 5,000 years BCE.
5,000 years.
Yeah, now the ancient Egyptian name for Osiris was Azar. The Egyptians showed reverence by placing the definite article "the" before their gods, as Christians say, the Christ.
Right.
So the Osiris translates to the Semitic word for Lord or God, El, making it Eleazar.
Eleazar, okay, I follow that. But wait, isn't Lazarus a fairly common Hebrew name derived from Eleazar? I mean, why should we jump straight to an Egyptian sun god instead of just a local Judean naming convention?
Well, that is the strongest opposing argument, that Lazarus is simply a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew Eleazar, which means God has helped. But Massey argues you have to look at the entire narrative complex, not just the name in isolation.
Okay, lay it out for me.
When the Romans and Greeks, who heavily interacted with Egyptian cults, Latinized Eliar, they added the us suffix used for male names, making it Eleazares. Over time, phonetic shifts occur. The initial E softens or drops, and the S can shift to a Z sound. You arrive at Lazarus.
I see the linguistic path.
But Massey's real point is the context. In the Egyptian myth, Osiris Assar is raised by Horus at a place called Anu. In the biblical text, Lazarus is raised at Bethany. Beth Anu in Hebrew means house of Anu.
Yeah.
Furthermore, Osiris has two sisters who mourn him, Isis and Nephthys. Lazarus has two sisters who mourn him, Mary and Martha. Massey argues that when you combine the etymological link with the two mourning sisters, the specific location of Beth Anu, and the act of a divine son raising the dead man from a tomb, the statistical probability of it being a purely independent historical event drops to zero. He argues it is a direct literary rescript of the Egyptian ritual.
That completely reframes how we look at the text. It implies the writers were intentionally historicizing an older spiritual allegory.
Yes, exactly.
Even the famous story of Jesus walking on water during the fourth watch of the night.
Yes, that corresponds precisely to the Egyptian ritual of the dead, where Horus walks the waters of the netherworld, conquering the chaotic elements. The fourth watch of the night is highly symbolic in Egyptian lore as the specific time the light principle, or the Christ principle, finally conquers the darkness just before dawn.
So none of it was meant to be literal history.
Massey's central thesis is that the miracles attributed to Jesus healing the blind, casting out devils into swine, the transfiguration on the mount, none of these were intended by their original architects to be understood as literal earthly events. They were otherworld occurrences designed to demonstrate profound spiritual truths about the journey of the human soul.
Okay, so if we step back and look at what Massey and others are claiming, if this Egyptian mythology was so ubiquitous throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, how did it get erased?
Right.
Because the biblical narrative is viewed today as an entirely original, independent historical event. It's almost like a modern tech company taking an open source piece of software, slapping their own logo on it, encrypting the code so no one else can see how it was built, and then claiming they invented the internet.
That's a great analogy.
But how did the Roman Empire actually pull off that kind of massive cultural encryption?
Well, it wasn't overnight. It was a gradual, highly strategic, and often violent political process. First, we have to look at the transition period and the movement known as Gnosticism. Scholar David Falk, analyzing the roots of early Christian thought, argues that early Christian Gnosticism was not, as conventional church history portrays it, a late Christian heresy that deviated from an original pure Orthodox history.
Right, because the standard narrative is that Jesus lived, established a historical church, and then a century later, these Gnostic groups splintered off and started getting weird with the theology.
Exactly. But Falk flips that timeline entirely. He traces the roots of Gnosticism directly back to Egyptian pre-Socratic philosophy, specifically the Thoth cult and Hermopolitan theology.
Hold on, before we go further into the weeds, what exactly is the Thoth cult and Hermopolitan theology? What do they actually believe?
Okay, so in ancient Egypt, there were several major theological centers, and one of the most prominent was Hermopolis. Their theological system centered around the Ogdoad, which were 8 primordial deities representing the chaotic, hidden forces of the universe before creation. Thoth was the god of wisdom, writing, and magic, who brought order to this chaos through the divine word, or logos.
The logos in the beginning was the word.
Exactly. Hermopolitan theology described the ultimate divine source as infinite in size, completely hidden, and unknowable through normal senses. It was a highly philosophical, esoteric tradition.
And by esoteric, you mean?
Esoteric meaning the focus was on internal knowledge, spiritual illumination, or what the Greeks called gnosis. Falk argues this Egyptian philosophical undercurrent, which focused on the divinity hidden within the human mind, is the actual genesis of Gnosticism. It existed well before Christianity.
So the Gnostics were essentially carrying forward the ancient Egyptian spiritual traditions. They were interpreting the Christ figure allegorically as a symbol for the divine potential that exists within everyone, rather than a literal man who lived in Judea.
Yes. To a Gnostic, the resurrection isn't a historical event that happened to one guy in a tomb. It's a psychological and spiritual awakening that must happen within you.
That's really profound.
It is. But that kind of internal, unregulatable spirituality poses a massive problem for empire building.
Politics.
Always. Walter Williams, along with the author of the controversial book Stolen Legacy, George G.M. James, they argue that Orthodox Christianity was eventually established as a Roman state religion specifically to rival, co-opt, and ultimately exterminate the ancient African and Egyptian mystery systems.
Why couldn't the Roman Empire just adopt the Egyptian religion as it was? I mean, they adopted Greek gods, they adopted local deities all over the empire. Why the need to exterminate this one?
Because the Egyptian mysteries, in their pure esoteric form, did not require a central state mediator. If every citizen believes they have direct internal access to the divine through gnosis, you cannot control them with the state priesthood. The empire realized they couldn't just beat the deeply entrenched Egyptian religion, they had to co-opt it, repackage it, and historicize it to control the narrative.
And we actually see the blueprint for this kind of religious engineering even earlier, right? With the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt.
Precisely. After Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, his general, Ptolemy I Soter, became pharaoh. The Ptolemies were Greek, but they needed to establish a stable power base over a massive native Egyptian population that deeply revered their own gods. So Ptolemy Sosthenes didn't just force Greek gods on the Egyptians, they strategically created a hybrid deity named Serapis.
They literally manufactured a god in a boardroom to solve a political problem. How did they even construct Serapis?
They convened Egyptian priests, like Manetho, and Greek priests. They combined the visual Hellenistic portrayal of a bearded Greek ruler like Zeus or Hades with the deeply ancient Egyptian traditions of the pharaoh and Osiris, the god of the afterlife.
Talk about a synthesis.
Yeah, and according to inscriptions at the Serapeum of Memphis, the ancient Egyptian Serapis was hailed as a savior god, and was even associated with being born of a virgin mother, represented in their rituals by the sacred Apis heifer. This shows us a clear historical precedent. Political leaders manufacturing religion, synthesizing mythologies, and creating a unified cult to stabilize their power base. It's exactly what the Roman Empire would do later on a much grander scale with the Council of Nicaea and subsequent decrees.
And once Rome adopted this synthesized, literalized version of Christianity, they eventually brought the hammer down on the original Egyptian sources, right? Because they didn't want anyone looking at the original open source code.
Exactly. The sources cite the edicts of Emperor Theodosius in the late 4th century and later Justinian as the brutal political mechanisms used to suppress the lofty culture system of the ancient world. They closed the ancient temples, disbanded the mystery schools, and basically relabeled thousands of years of African and Egyptian philosophy as illegal paganism.
So this represents a massive shift in human consciousness. We go from the esoteric to the exoteric.
That is the crux of Williams's argument. The esoteric is the internal, symbolic, spiritual rebirth, the mystery that happens within you. The exoteric is the literalized historical narrative that happens outside of you.
I see.
By brutally enforcing the exoteric view, the empire successfully locked the divine principle into a single, historically inaccessible figure who lived in the past. This effectively established the state church's ultimate authority. You no longer have the Christ within, you have to go through the institution, you have to obey the bishop, you have to pay the tithe. The original Egyptian concept of universal spiritual liberation was inverted into a tool for imperial control.
Wow. The scale of that erasure is profound. But according to Martin Bernal's massive work, Black Athena, this erasure wasn't limited just to religion and spirituality. He argues that the entire foundation of Western classical civilization has been systematically stripped of its Afroasiatic roots.
Yes.
And honestly, this challenges everything I thought I knew. I was taught the standard Western Civ curriculum. Greece was this pure European miracle. That philosophy, democracy, complex engineering, it all just miraculously sprang up in total isolation in Athens. What is the evidence Bernal uses to completely upend that isolated European narrative?
Well, Bernal starts by analyzing the historiography itself, how history has been written over the last 2 centuries. He challenges what he calls the 19th century Aryan model of history. He argues that this model, which completely dominated classical studies in European and American universities, was heavily influenced by the racism and anti-Semitism of the 18th and 19th centuries.
So the bias was baked in from the start.
Exactly. European scholars of that era simply could not stomach the idea that their beloved, pristine ancient Greece owed its intellectual and cultural foundations to Africans and Semitic peoples. So they systematically sought to purify Greek history of any Egyptian or Levantine influence.
They just wrote them out of the textbooks. But what did the ancient Greeks actually say about themselves? Did they claim to be a localized, isolated miracle?
Not at all. That's what makes Bernal's argument so compelling. He favors the revised ancient model, which, crucially, is the history the ancient Greeks themselves openly acknowledged. Greek historians like Herodotus and philosophers like Plato freely and frequently admitted their deep cultural, religious, and philosophical debts to Egypt. They viewed Egypt as the ancient font of wisdom and civilization. The Greeks weren't hiding it. It was later, modern European historians who scrubbed it out.
Okay, so what's the specific smoking gun evidence Bernal brings to the table to prove this Egyptian and Afroasiatic influence wasn't just ancient Greeks romanticizing their neighbors, but actual historical reality?
Bernal brings a massive amount of cross-disciplinary evidence, starting with linguistics and mythology. For example, consider the legendary Cretan king Minos, famous in Greek myth as the great lawgiver, the builder of the labyrinth, and the judge of the dead. Bernal traces the etymology of Minos directly back to the first Egyptian pharaoh Menes, who was also known as the foundational lawgiver and unifier of Egypt. The cultural archetype was imported along with the name.
What about the great Greek heroes? Does he look at figures like Hercules?
Yes. The Greek hero Heracles, or Hercules, is a prime example. Bernal derives the name Heracles from the Semitic root HRR, which means noble or freeborn. Furthermore, he heavily links the ancient Greek cults of Heracles to the Egyptian and Levantine cults of the bull and the sun. The cultural transmission from the Near East and Africa is embedded in the very names and rituals of the most famous Greek heroes.
Think about what this means for a second. If Bernal is right, the foundational DNA of Western literature, the myths we still make movies about today, aren't purely European, they are African and Semitic. That fundamentally changes how we view modern cultural ownership.
It absolutely does.
But is it just linguistic connections? What about the physical dirt? Does the archaeology support a massive influx of Egyptian influence into early Greece?
The archaeological overlap is undeniable once you know what you are looking at. Bernal points to enormous sophisticated granaries called rundbauten, found in the Argolid region of Greece, and vast, highly complex irrigation and drainage systems in Boeotia.
Why are those specific structures so important? Couldn't the early Greeks have just figured out how to build a granary or a ditch on their own?
Because of the prerequisite hydrology and engineering knowledge required, these drainage and irrigation techniques were incredibly intricate, designed to manage floodplains on a massive scale. They perfectly mirror Egyptian engineering capabilities, which had been developed over millennia to manage the Nile.
Ah, I see.
Early Greece, at that time, did not have the population density, the centralized state apparatus, or the historical trial and error period to suddenly invent these massive civil engineering projects out of nowhere. The sudden sophistication level strongly points to direct Egyptian influence, if not outright colonization or technological transfer by Egyptian engineers.
And there is historical precedent for that kind of massive movement of people and technology across the Mediterranean, right? The invasion of the Hyksos.
Yes, the Hyksos period is critical here. The Hyksos were a diverse group of Semitic-speaking Canaanites and Levantine peoples who migrated into Egypt and eventually grew powerful enough to rule parts of it as pharaohs for over a century. Bernal argues that their eventual expulsion from Egypt by the native Egyptian dynasties is historically mirrored in the Greek foundation legends.
Like which ones?
For instance, the legend of Danaos, who supposedly fled Egypt and colonized Argos in Greece, bringing with him agriculture and civilization. Bernal argues this isn't just a myth, it's a mythologized memory of actual historical refugees and elites fleeing Egypt and the Levant, and bringing their advanced Afroasiatic culture into the Egypt. It proves there was massive, sustained cultural, technological, and religious borrowing. Greece did not develop in a vacuum. It was the beneficiary of millennia of African and Near Eastern advancement.
So we have this vivid picture of Egypt and the Levant deeply influencing and essentially kickstarting Greek civilization. But how does the Hebrew Bible fit into this web of Mediterranean exchange? Because if we look at the timeline assumed by conventional scholars like John J. Collins, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is traditionally dated back to Moses, sometime around the 13th century BCE.
Right, that's the standard assumption.
That's centuries before the Greeks were building the Parthenon, or writing philosophy. But according to scholar Russell Jamerkin, the Torah wasn't ancient, and it wasn't just influencing the Greeks, it was fundamentally modeled on Greek literature. How can Jamerkin argue the Torah was actually written much later, around 270 BCE, using the Greek philosopher Plato as a blueprint?
To understand Jamerkin's thesis, you have to completely reorient your view of the Torah. You have to look at the Pentateuch not as an ancient Near Eastern relic, but through the lens of Hellenistic literature. Jimmerkin argues that the Pentateuch was composed by a specific group of people at a specific time. The 70 aristocratic Jewish scholars, the exact same scholars traditionally credited with translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, known as the Septuagint, and he argues they wrote it at the Great Library of Alexandria around 270 BCE.
Wait, so the traditional story is that these 70 scholars were brought to Alexandria by the Greek king just to translate a pre-existing ancient Hebrew Torah into Greek for the library. Jimmerkin is saying they didn't just translate it, they actually composed the original text right there in the library.
Exactly.
How would that even work? What was the environment like?
Well, paint a picture of the Great Library of Alexandria in 270 BCE under Ptolemy II Philadelphus. It was the greatest intellectual center the world had ever seen, containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Ptolemy II wanted to collect the laws and histories of all the peoples in his empire. He commissioned Babylonian priests like Berossus to write the history of Mesopotamia in Greek, and Egyptian priests like Manetho to write the history of Egypt in Greek. This created an intensely competitive intellectual atmosphere.
Oh, wow.
Every ethnic group in Alexandria was trying to prove that their nation had the most ancient, most noble, and most philosophically profound origins.
It's like an ancient cultural arms race.
That's exactly what it was. And the Jewish scholars in Alexandria, who were highly educated in Greek philosophy, needed a national epic and a law code that could compete with the Egyptians and the Babylonians on the world stage. Jimmerkin points out that they had access to the library's massive collection of Greek legal and philosophical texts, most notably the works of Plato and Aristotle. Jimmerkin identifies a direct, undeniable dependence in the Torah on Plato's work, specifically his final dialogue, the Laws, or Nomoi.
What exactly is in Plato's laws that shows up in the Torah?
Plato wrote a highly detailed philosophical blueprint for how to create a perfect, ideal colony. This blueprint included instructions on how to draft a national ethical literature. Crucially, Plato recommended mixing civil laws like property rights and torts with sacred religious laws and ethical exhortations within the same overarching text. This synthesis of the secular and the sacred was a distinctly Greek philosophical concept designed to make the citizens internalize the laws as divine will.
And the biblical laws mirror this Greek blueprint. But didn't the ancient Near East already have laws? What about Hammurabi's code? Couldn't the Torah just be copying that?
That is the conventional assumption, yeah, but Jimmerkin shows why it doesn't hold up structurally. Ancient Near Eastern laws, like Hammurabi's, were purely civil and administrative. They did not mix in religious rituals, dietary restrictions, or moral philosophy. But the Torah, exactly like Plato's ideal Greek law code, heavily mixes the sacred and the civic.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. Furthermore, Jimmerkin looks at the actual arrangement of the laws. Plato explicitly suggested arranging a nation's laws by descending severity, starting with the most serious crimes like homicide, then moving down to assault, property theft, and so on. We see this exact specific structure replicated in the Covenant Code in the Book of Exodus.
It's like the Alexandrian scholars found the open source code for how to build a perfect civilization, written by Plato, downloaded it, and used it to structure their own national literature.
That's a perfect analogy. And the parallels go deeper. Plato advised that the founders of a new colony should send envoys abroad to study the laws of foreign nations for up to 10 years, and then select the best laws to build a perfect constitution that would be the envy of the world.
Don't tell me that's in the Bible, too.
We see a direct echo of this international comparative legal consciousness in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, where the laws given to Moses are presented explicitly as something that will display immense wisdom and understanding to all the surrounding nations who hear about them. That is a Hellenistic philosophical perspective, not an ancient tribal one.
This changes everything about how we read the text. It's not just a list of rules handed down on a mountain. It's a highly sophisticated Greek-style constitution wrapped in a narrative. But how does Jimmerkin explain the narrative itself? The stories of Moses, the Exodus, Joshua conquering Canaan. Where did they get that structure if it wasn't historical?
Well, if we contrast the Torah with ancient Near Eastern law codes, the differences are stark. Near Eastern laws had no sprawling narrative context. They just had brief royal prologues where the king praised himself and his God, followed by a list of laws. The Torah, however, spends entire books telling a story before getting to the laws. Jimmerkin argues this uses a specific, well-known Greek literary genre called the notasis, or foundation story.
A foundation story, an origin myth for a new Greek colony.
Precisely. In a classic Greek and Martasis narrative, a divinely sanctioned founder leads a group of colonists out of a difficult situation, conquers a new land, violently drives out the indigenous inhabitants, apportions the territory among the tribes, and drafts a divine constitution to govern them forever.
Wow, so
Moses and Joshua perfectly, seamlessly mirror this Greek literary trope. Moses is the divine lawgiver. Joshua is the military conqueror who apportions the land. Kierkegaard's conclusion is that the narrative framework of the Exodus and the conquest is not ancient history. It is a Greek historiographical invention, a literary device used to frame and authorize the new legal code they were composing in Alexandria.
which means all those figures, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, David, Solomon, they're characters in a Hellenistic literary epic, not historical figures with continuous archaeological attestation.
Right, there's a total separation of their literary existence from historical attestation.
Okay, Jimmerkin's literary theory placing the Torah's creation in 270 BCE is incredibly compelling on a textual level. But what does the dirt say? We can argue about texts all day, but archaeology provides a physical reality check. If Collins and conventional scholars are right, and the Torah's laws governed Israel from the time of Moses, or at least from the First Temple period, we should see physical evidence of those specific rules in the ancient dirt. It's like claiming a society has had strict seatbelt laws for 100 years, but when you dig up all their old cars, not a single one has a seatbelt installed. Do we find the seatbelts of the Torah in ancient Israel?
According to Dr. Jonathan Adler's extensive, painstakingly detailed archaeological findings, we do not. And this is a crucial point where we must test the fundamental assumptions of scholars like Dr. John J. Collins.
Right.
Because Collins, in his work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, relies heavily on the assumed existence of deeply rooted ancient Judean legal traditions. But Adler's research, published recently in his book The Origins of Judaism, shows an absolute lack of widespread Torah observance prior to the middle of the 2nd century BCE.
Wait, I want to be perfectly clear on this. Nothing. No archaeological evidence of people following the Torah at all before the 2nd century BCE. That's over 1,000 years after Moses supposedly lived. What exactly did Adler look for?
Adler didn't look for vague religious sentiment. He looked for the specific, highly idiosyncratic physical markers demanded by Torah law. These are practices that leave an unmistakable trace in the dirt. He looked for tefillin, the phylacteries containing scripture that the Torah commands Jews to bind to their arms and foreheads. He looked for mezuzot, the scripture boxes attached to doorposts. He looked for the specialized stone vessels required because of the Torah's strict purity laws, which state that stone cannot contract ritual impurity like pottery can.
And the baths, right.
And most importantly, he looked for mikvot, the stepped ritual baths required for purification according to Levitical law.
And when he dug into the periods of the First Temple, the Babylonian exile, and the early Second Temple, what did he find?
Before the mid-2nd century BCE, all of these physical markers are entirely absent from the archaeological record. They simply do not exist in the dirt of Judea.
Wow. So if the conventional timeline is true, and the Torah was written by Moses around 1300 BCE, nobody was actually practicing its most basic daily physical requirements for 1,000 years. That stretches credulity to the breaking point.
It does. Adler's lack of early evidence aligns perfectly with a historical phenomenon that even conventional scholars like Collins identify as the halakhic turn. Halakha is the body of Jewish religious law derived from the written and oral Torah. The archaeology shows that this intense focus on halakha, on strict legal observance, did not exist anciently. It suddenly appeared. The Hasmonean dynasty, the Jewish kings who ruled in independent Judea in the mid-2nd century BCE following the Maccabean revolt, they needed a way to unify a diverse, fragmented population. They first utilized the Torah as a political tool for national unification. This political decision sparked a sudden explosion of legal literature and debate, which we see heavily reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in texts like 4QMMT, which obsess over minute details of ritual purity.
So the Hasmoneans essentially activated this text, which Jimmerkin argues was written only a century prior in Alexandria, and implemented it as national constitutional law to unify the people under their new kingdom.
Yes, and we actually have documentary evidence to support this late adoption coming from outside of Judea. We have the Elephantine Papyri. These are an incredible cache of documents from a Judean military community living on Elephantine Island in the Nile River in Egypt during the 5th century BCE. This is a crucial time period, well after the supposed time of Moses during the Persian period, but before the Hellenistic era and the translation of the Septuagint.
So these are Judeans living in Egypt, writing letters about their daily lives and religion. What do these papyri show? Are they following the Torah? Do they mention Moses or the Exodus?
Not at all. And that silence is deafening. The documents show this Judean community had their own fully functioning temple to their god Yahweh right there in Egypt.
Yeah.
They were offering animal sacrifices on their own altar.
Oh, wow.
Which strictly, blatantly violates the core laws of Deuteronomy, which mandate that sacrifices can only be offered in the one central temple in Jerusalem. Furthermore, they apparently worshipped Yahu alongside other deities, like a goddess named Anat Yahu.
So they were polytheistic Judeans of the local temple. That completely contradicts the biblical narrative of how Judeans were supposed to behave after the Babylonian exile. But what about their holidays? Do they celebrate Passover?
They do have a letter, famously known as the Passover Papyrus, dating to 419 BCE. But when you read it, it is astonishing for what it doesn't say. It mentions a festival of unleavened bread, but there is absolutely no mention of the Exodus story, no mention of Moses, no mention of Egypt, and no awareness of the strict, detailed Pentateuchal laws governing the festival that we see in Exodus or Leviticus. It appears to be an agricultural spring festival, not a historical commemoration of escaping slavery.
If Adler's dirt and the Elephantine texts prove the Jewish legal tradition as we know it was basically invented or at least heavily formalized in the Hellenistic era, that creates a massive problem for the timeline. It means the law wasn't ancient national law, so what was it before the Hasmoneans enforced it?
This is where we look to the theories of scholars like Michael Lefebvre. He posits that the Pentateuch underwent a fundamental recharacterization. Initially, older parts of the text may have existed as descriptive literature, a loose collection of local customs, priestly rituals, and tribal lore, perhaps used for local arbitration, but never enforced as state law. But it was only after Judean elites were exposed to Greek administrative concepts of written, constitutional law in the Ptolemaic court that the Torah was transformed. It was upgraded from descriptive local customs to a prescriptive, binding national law code.
They took their local traditions, combined them with Greek legal philosophy, and retrojected it all back in time to Moses to give it ultimate ancient authority.
Exactly. And this severely challenges the fundamental assumption of continuous ancient biblical Jewish history that scholars like John J. Collins rely upon to contextualize the Dead Sea Scrolls. The archaeology and the comparative texts strongly suggest a much later Hellenistic synthesis.
Okay, this brings us to a massive turning point in our investigation. Because if Adler's dirt and Jumerkin's textual analysis prove the Old Testament context is a relatively recent Hellenistic invention, that creates a tectonic shift for the Christian texts. The Gospels assume a strictly observant, ancient Jewish society operating in the first century under laws that had been there for a millennium.
Yeah, they do.
If that foundation is shaky, what does that mean for the New Testament? Let's scrutinize the actual historical documentation for Jesus and early Christianity, because whenever this topic comes up, people immediately point to the Roman historians. They say Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Josephus, Suetonius. Don't they definitively, objectively prove Jesus was a historical figure who walked the earth in the first century?
That is the most common defense, yeah.
Yeah.
But when we critically assess those specific Roman and Jewish sources, as researchers like Tom Harper, Earl Doherty, and others have rigorously done, the picture falls apart. The most glaring, undeniable issue is the total absence of contemporary, independent historical documentation.
Meaning nobody writing while Jesus was supposedly alive or immediately after actually noticed him.
Correct. The reigns of the Roman emperors Augustus and Tiberius form a highly documented era. We have records of minor political skirmishes, philosophical debates, and obscure cults. Yet, no non-Christian writer, historian, or bureaucrat notes Jesus' existence, his miracles, or his crucifixion during that time.
Not a single one.
Not Philo of Alexandria, who lived at the exact same time and wrote extensively about Jewish sects. Not a single Roman record of his trial. The references in Josephus, Tacitus, and Pliny that apologists rely on all come much later, often decades, or over a century after the supposed events.
And aren't those later references highly debated by mainstream scholars anyway? I know the Josephus passage is notoriously problematic.
Yes. The famous passage in Josephus, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, is widely recognized by almost all critical scholars as having been tampered with. It was subjected to later Christian interpolation, meaning Christian scribes, copying the text centuries later, inserted glowing phrases about Jesus being the Messiah to bolster their own history. Once you remove the obvious forgeries, it's highly debatable if Josephus originally mentioned him at all.
Right.
And even the Roman historians like Pliny the Younger, writing in the early 2nd century, are merely reporting on what Christians in his province believed at the time. Pliny is saying, I interrogated these Christians, and they sing hymns to Christ as to a god. He is not providing independent archival verification of a historical man who lived a century earlier.
This brings us back to challenging Collins's focus on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Collins uses the scrolls to say, look, the Jewish people at Qumran were expecting a Messiah, they had all these apocalyptic concepts, and then Jesus arrived and fulfilled that historical context.
But scholars like Earl Doherty argue that Collins has the causality backwards. The scrolls don't prove a historical Jesus was expected. They prove that the literary and theological raw materials used to invent Jesus already existed. Furthermore, Doherty points out that the names themselves reveal their mythic, non-historical origins. Jesus, or Yeshua, simply translates to Savior, and Christ or Messiah means Anointed One. These weren't originally the surnames of a specific human individual from Nazareth. They were widespread spiritual concepts.
Concepts like the Logos.
Exactly. The Hellenistic idea of the Logos, a divine mediating principle between the unknowable God and humanity, was everywhere in sectarian circles across the Roman Empire. The Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate a pre-Christian environment deeply filled with messianic, apocalyptic, priestly, atoning, and Son of God concepts.
Right, the environment was already primed.
Yeah, but these were theological ideas. The mistake is assuming that because the ideas existed, they must have eventually coalesced into a single historical person. The critical view is that early Christian writers later raided these Jewish texts, combining them with the Greek and Egyptian myths we discussed, to construct a narrative around a mythical savior.
I want to dig into that construction a little more because the Gospels are full of incredibly specific details. The Bethlehem birth, the massacre of the innocents, the temptation in the desert, the trial, the earthquake at the crucifixion, the empty tomb. If none of this is historical, how do scholars explain the historical plausibility of every major narrative beat?
They explain it by showing how each beat is derived from previous literature or mythology. It's not history, it's literary dependence.
Yeah.
Take the massacre of the innocents by King Herod. There is zero historical record of Herod doing this, but it perfectly mirrors the Pharaoh trying to kill the infant Moses in the Old Testament. The temptation of the desert for 40 days. It mirrors Moses on the mountain for 40 days and Israel wandering for 40 years.
It's just mirroring the older texts.
Yes. The trial, the betrayal by a friend, the darkness at noon, the earthquake, these are all well-known Greco-Roman divine man traditions and literary tropes. Even the concept of a Davidic descent was a necessary scriptural retrojection. They had to write a genealogy proving he was from the line of David because the older Jewish texts said the Messiah had to be from David. It's a strategy to root a new Mediterranean salvation cult in an invented ancient sacred history.
So if the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, aren't historical biographies, what exactly are they? How were they written?
The Gospels are best understood and assessed as faith documents and extensive works of Midrash. Midrash is a highly developed Jewish literary method of interpreting, updating, and expanding upon older scripture to find new meaning for a current situation. The evangelists, writing anonymously decades after the supposed events, weren't conducting historical research or interviewing eyewitnesses.
They were theologians, not historians.
Exactly. They were engaged in a complex myth-making process. They relied heavily on the Hebrew literary trope of the suffering and vindication of the innocent righteous one.
Can you give an example of that trope, like the stories in Isaiah or the Book of Daniel or Esther?
Exactly those. It's a recurrent, powerful motif in Jewish literature. The pious, innocent figure who is falsely accused, persecuted by the powerful, suffers unjustly, but is eventually vindicated and exalted by God. You see it perfectly in the suffering servant passages of Isaiah 53, or the Psalms of Lament. Early Christian writers essentially took this Jewish literary trope, combined it with the Hellenistic logos theology, and merged it with the ancient Egyptian dying and rising god myths of Osiris that Massey identified.
It's a massive cross-cultural synthesis. They took the best spiritual technology from Egypt, Greece, and Judea and wove it into a single story.
It is a brilliant literary synthesis. A localized sect of missionaries essentially historicized these profound spiritual allegories. They took the eternal myth of the Son, the psychological truth of spiritual renewal, the Gnostic concept of the Christ principle within, and the Jewish hope for national vindication.
And packaged it all together.
They took all of that and rooted it in an invented, literal sacred history to create a new, highly exportable Mediterranean salvation cult. And they set it in the recent past, the 1st century, to give it the illusion of immediate historical authority.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and look at the breathtaking journey we've just been on today. We started by questioning the precision of historical narratives. We've seen how a diverse array of scholars, Massey, Bernal, Jamerkin, Williams, Adler, argue that what we call Judeo-Christian history is actually a brilliant late-stage synthesis. It's not an isolated, literal timeline dropping out of the sky. It borrows the profound astronomical spiritual allegories of ancient Egypt, the civic and constitutional frameworks of Hellenistic Greece, and the myth-making apparatus of the Roman era.
And by rigorously testing the assumptions of conventional scholarship, like that of John J. Collins, against the actual dirt dug up by archaeologists and the comparative texts sitting in our museums, we reveal a very different, far more complex origin story for Western civilization.
It's a story of profound interconnectedness. It means we aren't isolated. Our culture is a tapestry woven from African, Semitic, and European threads.
Which leads to a final, slightly provocative thought for you to mull over as we end this deep dive. We've discussed how the original Egyptian and Gnostic intent behind the Christ figure, and perhaps even the original local intent behind biblical customs, was deeply esoteric. It was meant to be a symbol for internal spiritual evolution, representing the immense, untapped potential divinity within every single human being.
The mystery within, the idea that you don't need a mediator.
Exactly. So what happens to human consciousness when an empire successfully flattens that universal, empowering myth into a literal historical biography? By enforcing the history, by demanding that you believe these events happened externally to one specific man in one specific place 2,000 years ago, does the institution actually rob us of the original transformative mystery? By demanding we worship the history, have we lost access to the myth?
Containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.